Most calendars are based on the sun. So our January through December calendar is roughly based around the rotation of the Earth around the sun, with those adjustments that get made every few years for the fact that it isn't exactly 365 days that it takes to go around. And our liturgical calendar is, the great big caveat here, it's really based around the Northern Hemisphere, as you'll see when we get a little further in. If you're in the Southern Hemisphere, there's a lot of things about our liturgical calendar that don't make quite as much sense, because the darkest time of the year is the time that we celebrate Christmas, but for them it's height of summer, and there's some ways in which that symbolically maybe doesn't make quite as much sense. And if you live right at the equator, the differences in daylight from one season to another are not huge. So some very ancient calendars, when people first began to sort of try to figure out how to regularize, what do we call this season, what do we call this day, were based around rainy seasons, flood seasons, agricultural cycles, of course. But because daylight differences weren't that great, it was a little harder to track the sun. So, big caveat, our calendar is certainly our secular calendar, and a big part of our liturgical calendar is based around the solar calendar. And we have, as we will discuss, we have actual connections between the equinoxes and the solstices to our Christian liturgical calendar. However, there are actually three different kinds of ways that people have created calendars. There's solar calendars, there's lunar calendars based around the moon. Lunar calendars are convenient because the moon, generally speaking, is a little easier to observe, and it's a shorter cycle. So it's very easy to just look up in the sky and say, okay, this is a waxing moon, this is a waning moon, it's a full moon. A little easier than having an instrument that would measure exactly how far the sun is in the sky, right? So lunar calendars had the advantage of being not requiring a lot of instrumentation necessarily, and no matter where you are on the Earth, the moon is going to be changing in its cycle, whereas the solar differences are different based on your latitude. The Islamic calendar, that's it on the left, is strictly lunar. So, because the moon doesn't exactly line up into a 365-day cycle, that means that the months in a lunar calendar will kind of move around from year to year. This is why Ramadan is not in the same season every year, right? It moves through the year. Well, I like to think it sort of moves backwards. So a few years ago, Ramadan was in the summer. Right now, they're just finishing it this week. Eid is Tuesday this week. So Ramadan will come to an end now in the spring. And in a few years, it'll be in the winter again. It moves around because the lunar cycles don't line up with our solar calendar. That's obviously a problem if you're trying to be really regular from year to year. And so many cultures developed what's called a lunisolar calendar, which is mostly based on the cycles of the moon, but has corrections so that holidays and things like that will line up in basically the same season from year to year. So the Chinese calendar is lunisolar. It's lunar, but they make corrections, and that's why the Chinese New Year is always more or less in early February, right? It's not always the same day with our solar calendar, but it will still be in the same season. That's true also of the Jewish calendar. The Hebrew calendar is lunisolar, which means it's mostly based on the moon, but there are intercalations, there are corrections made from year to year, so that pretty much the seasons will line up with those lunar months from year to year. So you always have Jewish New Year in the fall, you always have Passover in the spring, always have Purim in the spring, even though it won't be on exactly the same calendar day with our solar calendar. Follow? Okay. So, how did Christians end up with the calendar we have? We have some things that are based strictly on a solar calendar. They don't move around, like Christmas, always December 25th. And we have some things that move around, what were called movable feasts, Easter being the main one. And because Pentecost is based on when Easter is, Pentecost moves around with it, always 50 days after Easter. By the way, the reason Pentecost is 50 days after Easter is why? Anybody know? What? Penta means 5, yes. I may know. Pentecost is 7 weeks after Easter. The reason being, Pentecost was a Jewish festival that came a certain interval after Passover. So, in the same way that Passover moves around a little bit from year to year, Pentecost would have been in that interval after the first Easter. Okay, so our annual cycle, you could say, begins with Easter. Easter is the primary Christian festival. The rest of the secular world doesn't really know that. They think Christmas is a bigger deal, but Christmas really has only been a big deal for about the last 200 years in the larger Western culture. Really, Easter has been the center of our year because it is really the singular moment, right? When Jesus Christ is revealed as Lord and the resurrection is what it's all about. And it's the one day within the life of Christ that we can say more or less we know what time of year it happened. Why? Why do we know when Easter was? Yeah. The events took place around Passover, yes. So we know that Jesus was crucified around Passover. I say around because there's actually a little bit of a difference in the Gospels. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it says that the disciples celebrated the Passover meal at the Last Supper, and then Jesus was crucified. In John, it says that Jesus was crucified on the day of preparation, which is the day before Passover begins. John wants us to make this connection to the Lamb of God, and that Jesus is the Lamb of God. And so the lambs were sacrificed on the day of preparation. And so John says that Good Friday is the day of preparation. So there's a couple days difference, actually, in the Gospels as to when exactly Jesus was crucified. But we at least know that it happened in the spring. That's not true of almost anything else in the Gospels. It doesn't say anything about seasons for many of the major events of Jesus' life, but it is true of Easter. So we can at least start there. Passover is lunar. It's, as we said, the Jewish calendar, Hebrew calendar is lunar. And this is from Leviticus, dictating when Passover occurs. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month, at twilight, there shall be a Passover offering to the Lord. And the 15th day of the same month is the festival of unleavened bread. So Passover is a week-long festival. Hebrew calendar has been tracking this for centuries. We can more or less calculate when Passover was. If we guesstimate which year Jesus died in, that's also another thing scholars could disagree about, whether it was 80-30 or 80-33. But they have some pretty good estimates of when that would have occurred. And so we at least have that much data on when the first Easter occurred. So you might ask, well, why don't we just celebrate Easter whenever Passover happens? You may have noticed this year, Passover is not the same as Easter. Some years it lines up around the same week, and some years it doesn't. Why is it that our calendar doesn't just line up with Passover? That's where the history gets really interesting. So this is a Hebrew calendar, a very old one from the 20s, and it is tracking when Passover and Purim, actually this is tracking Purim, so this is for the month of Adar, which comes before the month of Nisan, which is the month of Easter or Passover. But you can just see how those dates are going to move around because they are part of the solar calendar. We can go back and look through and sort of say, okay, probably, I'm going to see if I can find my notes here, sorry, without you having to see that. Anybody know how to do the presentation view here? Hang on. All right, never mind. We'll go back. All right. All that is to say, there was two different modes or two different understandings of what Christians should do. Once the early church sort of said, well, yes, of course, Jesus was crucified around Passover. Let's celebrate Easter around the same time. Obviously, Easter should be a spring festival. There were a couple different schools of thought, and there were a couple of problems. One was everyone knew that Jesus rose on a Sunday. Passover doesn't always fall on a Sunday, right? So you wouldn't because Passover was going to move around within the week, you wouldn't necessarily just line up Easter with Passover because they wanted to celebrate Easter on a Sunday, on the first day of the week, in the same way that, sorry, I really want to make this better for you. Here we go. There we go. Okay. And the second problem was over the course of the first century, there got to be a bit of a rift between the synagogues and the early Christian church. And we hear more about that or can see evidence of that, especially in the Gospel of John, right? That there was more of a separation from Jews who followed Jesus and the early Christian church. And as that rift grew bigger and bigger, there was this sense of, well, we don't want our celebration of Easter to be dependent on when the rabbis say Passover is. There was this sense of we need our own calculations, our own calendar that doesn't rely on the Hebrew calendar in order to determine when we should have Easter. But there were different schools of thought, and for the first 200-300 years of Christianity, there were regional differences in where people, when and how people would celebrate Easter. There was a school of thought called the Quartodecimans. Quartodecimans means the 14ers, who, because it said Passover is the 14th day of the month of Nisan, that's when we should have Easter. We should just have it then, right? We know it's the 14th day. So 14th day of that moon, that's when we're going to have Easter. There was a school of thought that went that way, and then there was a school of thought that said, no, we're going to have our own calculations and we're going to decide. But it got to be all over the map. Early Christian practice was very, very diverse as the church spread across different parts of the world and different cultures and languages. And it wasn't until the Council of Nicaea, the very famous Council of Nicaea, that uniformized a lot of things, that they made a determination. They said, okay, this is what we're going to do. Easter should not be dependent on the Hebrew calendar. Easter should be a Sunday, always. And Easter should be celebrated with uniformity throughout the world. 1,700 years later, we're still waiting on that one. That part did not come to pass. But the Council of Nicaea did come up with some ways to sort of say, this is how we think Easter should be calculated. Now, quiz, who thinks they know how Easter is calculated? Go ahead, Carl. First Sunday after the first full moon, after the vernal equinox. That is partly true. The question is, a vernal equinox according to whom? So, if it were strictly after the vernal equinox, then it would be something that just would be pretty uniform throughout the world, more or less, right? That standard answer does not take into account that this problem that the early church had was that they didn't want to rely on the observations of the rabbis. And it was the observations of the rabbis of the cycles of the moon that had determined when the months fell and when that full moon really was and when the vernal equinox really was. So they came up with a different way of calculating when that first full moon was, and it was called the ecclesiastical moon. They had their own calendar of the moon cycle. Now, because most people assume that when you say, okay, it's the first Sunday after the first full moon, after the vernal equinox, this should be something that any observatory can tell me when it is. There's a number of humorous stories of people calling up the Vatican Observatory or the British Royal Observatory and saying, hey, I need to know when Easter's going to be in 2029, can you tell me when the first full moon is, and they all say, hold the phone, and they go find a Book of Common Prayer and say, okay, Easter in 2029 is April 5th. Because it doesn't line up with a strictly astronomical observation, they had their own formula that they came up with that would determine when these ecclesiastical moons took place. And they had something called the golden number. This is a very old manuscript describing that cycle, but it's the same cycle that's still in the Book of Common Prayer, which is you take the year, you divide it by 19, take that remainder, you add 1, and it gives you a number. That number is 1 to 19, and that 19-year cycle is how they determine when Easter is. Got that? Now, if that sounds complicated, all you have to do is look up date of Easter on Wikipedia. There is like 8 pages of calculations. It is quite stunning. Somebody who really loves math had a lot of fun figuring this out and looking at hundreds of years of these calculations of how people were trying to figure out when Easter falls. So the golden number is what it's called. The golden number of 1 to 19 will tell you how Easter is supposed to fall. But then even with that, there are a few exceptions thrown in for leap years and years that end in 00 and things like that. So it turns out to be way more complicated than you thought, which is part of the reason we still don't have uniformity across the Christian church, because they made it pretty complicated. But in the Western church, anyway, and by Western I mean Rome, Roman Catholics, Protestants, Church of England, we pretty much have agreed the golden number system is what we're going to use. The other wrinkle is that there was this shift from the Julian to the Gregorian calendar. Now, most of us sort of assume that we know how the calendar works, right? Every 4 years, we add a leap day to make up for the fact that the year isn't exactly 365 days, so you have to add a day every 4 years so that we don't fall behind. That actually is the Julian calendar. And even when you add a leap year every 4 years, you still end up a little bit off. And they started to notice this. The Julian calendar comes from Julius Caesar. Ironically, Christian church throughout the world followed the calendar of the emperor of the empire that crucified Jesus, but that's another story. So they followed this Julian calendar for 1,000 years or so, and then started to notice that things were getting off, that days were falling not quite in the same season as they had, that they noticed that there wasn't something quite lining up. And around the time of Pope Gregory there on the right, there were astronomers who sort of figured out what was going on, what the discrepancy was, and how to make a correction. So Pope Gregory was the one who said, again, the one who's trying to make everything uniform across all of Christendom. He said we should all shift to the Gregorian calendar so that we make these corrections. The Gregorian calendar makes corrections every, let's see if I can get this right. What was that? It's every 400 years, yes. So it's every 100 years except for the years that are divisible by 400. There's another day added. So just to make it really complicated, right? They did agree to do this slowly. So 1582 would have been when the Holy Roman Empire made the shift. What that meant, by then they had gotten off by about 11 days, and so 11 days were added, or were skipped basically, so that they went from March 21st to April 6th, I think, and or March 25th to April 6th, and made that correction to get in sync again. So the Holy Roman Empire and France made that shift late in the 16th century. Lorraine, just being contrary, part of France, didn't do it until 1760. Britain made the shift in 1752, but not Scotland. They did it at a different time. And Russia didn't make the shift until 1918. So hundreds of years of different parts of Europe using different calendars, which is sort of fascinating, right? And I think also very symptomatic of what calendars mean to us, right? Just like the early church was like, well, we're not going to let the Hebrews tell us when we should be celebrating Easter. You had parts of Europe saying, well, we're not going to let them tell us which day of the year it is, right? So these shifts got made very slowly, but that shift is the main reason that the Eastern Church and the Western Church to this day still don't celebrate Easter at the same time. So Orthodox Easter is sometimes very close or on the same date as our Western Easter, and some years it's not. This year, Orthodox Easter is not until May 5th. So it can be as much more than a month later, it's almost always later, than Western Easter. And that is largely because of that shift from the Julian to the Gregorian calendar. Even though the countries in which Easter is celebrated in the East are on a Gregorian calendar with the rest of the world, their liturgical calendar is still Julian. That's how it is. So, people have had lots of conversations about this, right? Christian leaders have said this isn't good for church unity. It's not good for our witness to the rest of the world that we can't even agree on when to celebrate Easter. And they've had all kinds of different proposals over the years to try and get it synced back up again. As recently as 2018, these four guys agreed that there should be an attempt to bring everything back into sync in 2025. I may want to know why 2025. You already know. Because 2025 is the 1700th anniversary of the Council of Nicaea. And since they said we should have worldwide uniformity back in 325, what better year to make the shift than 2025? So these guys, this is the Archbishop of Canterbury. We have the Patriarch Bartholomew, who's the Patriarch of the Greek Orthodox Church and a number of other Orthodox communions. Next to him, we have the Russian Patriarch of the Orthodox Church, and then Pope Francis. Well, what's happened between 2018 and now? So much, particularly in the Orthodox Church. The Greek Church and the Russian Church are not currently really talking to each other because of the war in Ukraine. The Russian Orthodox hierarchy has been very closely linked to the oligarchy of Russia and to Vladimir Putin, and so somewhat in solidarity with Ukraine, other parts of the Orthodox communion have said, you're way off base. So it's highly unlikely that there's going to be a huge shift in 2025, next year, on this front. So this may have been just one of many, many conversations they've had about trying to sync up Easter and not succeeding. Those proposals for change have been, obviously the other question is like, how are you going to sync it up, right? What's the answer? Some proposals have been to say, rather than keep to this lunisolar, always trying to figure out when the moon is, calculation, why don't we just say it's on the second Sunday of April, as long as the second Sunday of April falls after the second Saturday of April, right? You know, so you have different ways of saying it's not necessarily going to be, depending on how the days of the week line up, but trying to come up with sort of a, like Thanksgiving, how we say it's always the third Sunday or third Thursday of November. Easter would be something like that, first or second Sunday of April. Those proposals are mostly based on some actual historical data too, like the assumption, or most scholars agree that probably the day of the resurrection was early April, based on when Passover would have fallen around the time that we think Jesus died. And of course, it has a lot of advantages in just planning, right? in world planning, to be able to just say, we all know that every year Easter's going to be the second Sunday of April, instead of every single year we have to do this dance of when is Easter, and when are people's spring breaks, and why is it different this year than that year, and how come the Orthodox aren't doing it at the same time? And so it does have some advantages to make it uniform, but it's not an easy conversation. It's not an easy conversation in terms of church unity and the geopolitics of the world. And it also shows up how slowly things move in ecumenical conversation. One of the articles I was reading about this said, so, you know, that there were some parts of the Eastern Church that sort of said, well, why is it that we have to adjust, you know, this seems like a Western calculation, why is it that we have to adjust for their sake, you know, it's not fair. And, and the reply came, well, you know, the Western Church had to wait hundreds of years for the Eastern Church to finally switch over to the Gregorian calendar, so, you know, it's their turn to make some compromises several hundred years later, but anyway. So that's where we're at with Easter. I don't know that it's going to happen, that we will finally end up with some sort of synced up Easter across the East and the West. However, it does sync up about, you can see, so this, I know this is hard to see. This is Julian Easter. This would be the Eastern dates. And this is Gregorian Easter, and you can see that about every 3 years they are the same date, more or less, but not always. And there are some years where the dates are different by as much as 5 weeks, or 4 or 5 weeks. So back to the solar calendar. Easter and Pentecost move around. Christmas does not. So we start with Christmas as sort of a fixed point. There's no evidence that Christmas, the birth of Jesus, happened in the winter. In fact, it's probably more likely that Jesus was born in the spring too, because they were out in the fields abiding with their flocks at night, which is usually only what you do if you were expecting lambs to be born, which would be in the spring. However, it's sort of inconvenient to be trying to do Easter and Christmas at the same time, I guess. Imagine what a commercial mess that would create if it all had to be in the spring. So the early church did have, in the Roman Empire, there was this, you know, festival of the winter solstice, and so it was probably a matter of convenience that the early church said, why don't we celebrate the birth of Christ at the same time that the rest of our secular world is, or our Roman world is celebrating the solstice? It sort of made sacred what was already a time of celebrating, and it had the advantage of having some symbolic value in the Northern Hemisphere. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it, right? That's John 1, and the idea of Christ, the light, coming into the world in the midst of darkness. There's a great symbolic thing about that. Not if you live in Australia, but if you're in the Northern Hemisphere, it works really well, right? So Christmas is one of those dates that became a fixed point fairly early on, although it was not although there certainly were secular festivals of the solstice. Christmas, as we think of it, as like this really big time of gift giving where everybody has the day off and everybody, that's a fairly recent invention. The best example I heard of this was, anybody remember at the end of Dickens' A Christmas Carol, what Scrooge tells somebody to do when he's finally come around? It's Christmas morning and he's like, transformed. What does he say to go celebrate Christmas? Sends the goodbye to go buy a goose. The butcher was open on Christmas morning, right? It would have been in that era of England, because it wasn't, although it was a sacred holiday, it was not a vast secular holiday. So it's actually fairly recent in our time that it's become such a widespread holiday that everybody, including many Jews, celebrate. Sort of fascinating. All right, so December 25th is our fixed point. Now, going back to our solar calendar, right? If we have that for the winter solstice, anybody want to guess what is marked at the summer solstice? This is a very less known Christian holiday. Yeah. Yes, bingo. But first, we're going to go back 9 months before back to the spring equinox. So, spring equinox, you could say Easter really is our spring equinox festival, right? However, if Jesus was born on December 25th, that means the Annunciation had to be on March 25th. So this has an interesting little bit of trivia to it. March 25th was, for a time, in some parts of the Christian church, also the fixed date for Good Friday. Because there was this idea that great people were either born or conceived on the same day that they died. And so the idea was, well, Jesus must have been conceived on March 25th because he was born on December 25th, and we know that he died on Good Friday. And so the Annunciation and Good Friday often were very close together or even on the same day. But to this day, March 25th is the Feast of the Annunciation, and the day we remember Mary's acceptance of the becoming the mother of Christ. Working from there, other little bit of trivia. Okay, this is kind of fun. March 25th is Worldwide Tolkien Reading Day. Anybody want to know? Anybody know that? Why? So, Tolkien, as you may know, J.R. Tolkien was a great fan of all things old European and very old English, right? And so he was well aware that March 25th had this history of being the day of Good Friday and the day of Annunciation. And in his trilogy, he worked it out so that the Fellowship of the Ring leaves Rivendell on December 25th. And the ring is destroyed and Sauron is defeated on March 25th. Only, extremely avid readers of Tolkien would track this, but there are a lot of very avid readers of Tolkien. So, Sauron is defeated on March 25th. This was just a little Easter egg, if you will, that Tolkien put into the books for those who would be paying attention to make that connection between the defeat of evil in the Old English tradition on Good Friday and the defeat of Sauron in his books. So, kind of a fun bit. All right, so back to summer solstice. So, if Christ is in John 1, the light that comes into the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it, the height of light in the northern hemisphere, the summer solstice, ends up being the birth of the John the Baptist, and it's based more or less on this verse here. When John is introducing Jesus to the world and saying, "Behold the Lamb of God," he says, "He must increase, but I must decrease." So the idea is that John knew that as his own, as he hands off his work to Jesus, right, as he points to Jesus, his own fame is going to diminish and Jesus will rise. And so we have this idea that at summer solstice, to celebrate the birth of John the Baptist, as the one who points the way to Christ, but is not the light, right? John is not the light. So as we're celebrating the most light we have, we also remember the one who was not the light. So that's John the Baptist on summer solstice. And then, so we've hit both solstices, yes, winter, summer. We've talked about vernal equinox. Anybody want to guess what the fall equinox has? This is a much less known one in the United States. Nope. Fall equinox has Saint Michael and all angels. If you have lived in the United Kingdom, you might be familiar with the term Michaelmas, right? Michaelmas, the feast of Saint Michael. They name some of their school terms. The fall term is called the Michaelmas term. It's also the time of harvesting of hops, and so it sometimes is a bit of a beer festival as well. But so the church decided to celebrate the angels, and it sort of fits with that fall sense of, as the light diminishes, we become more conscious or thinking, I think, more about those things that we cannot see. And so at fall equinox is the marking of all angels. So you'd think we'd be done at this point, right? We've done both solstices, we've got both equinoxes, but there's more. All right, this chart, I just love this. It's kind of fun. So this shows, these four are the old Celtic seasons. We have our astronomical seasons here. This is, the green is spring, the blue is winter, this is fall, this is summer. And on the outside you have our, more or less, our solar seasons. So these are, and the months out here. So if we've talked about the 4 points, the solstices and the equinoxes, but in between solstice and equinox, there's another marker point, right? So every 6 weeks, there's another sort of marker point in the solar year. And you know when some of these marker points are, you just may not know the Christian connection to them. The first one we all are familiar with, right? February 2nd. It's 6 weeks, right? 6 weeks after Christmas, 6 weeks before the spring equinox. It's that midpoint of winter. We think of it as Groundhog Day. When we're thinking about, is winter over yet? When's spring coming? But it has a Christian connection. It was called Candlemas for many centuries. Very few, not too many traditions still celebrate the blessing of candles. That's not a really common practice, but there are some parts of Europe that will still do it. But it's the presentation of our Lord. So 6 weeks after Christmas is the time around when Jesus' parents would have taken him to the temple, right? About 40 days after the birth of a child was often the time of the presenting of a child, and so February 2nd is marked on the Christian calendar as the presentation. Side note, almost all of these dates around Christmas and the cross-quarter dates are based mostly on Luke's gospel, because Luke's the only one that tells us all these things around Jesus' birth, right? There's not a lot about Jesus' birth in the other Gospels. All right, another cross-quarter day. So who can guess when the next one would be? If we have February 2nd, and then we have the spring equinox, and what falls halfway between the spring equinox and summer? No, I heard it back here. May Day, yes. All right, so we usually just think of it as May Day, right? It's the the height of spring, the celebration of spring. There's ancient practices like maypoles and other kinds of celebrations that happen. The Celtic cultures had a big celebration around May 1st. In the Christian calendar, it's the visitation. And this, again, based on Luke's gospel, right? If the Annunciation happens on March 25th, then what happens after Mary gets the news that she is going to bear Jesus? She goes to visit her cousin Elizabeth, who is already with child with John the Baptist, whose birth we're going to celebrate in June. So halfway in between, we celebrate this moment where the two of them, Mary and Elizabeth, meet together, and that famous moment in which Elizabeth says to Mary, you know, blessed are you among women, right? And that the child leaps in her womb, and she recognizes that the child that Mary is bearing is very special. So the visitation is celebrated May 1st. That's based mostly on Luke's gospel and that sequence of events. It's also, I think, just sort of what better time to celebrate two pregnant women than the height of spring, right? It's sort of this a celebration of fruitfulness, of the amazing new life that's about to come about. Interestingly, Mother's Day might be in this country. Mother's Day is very American, though. In England, what they call it Mothering Sunday, and it's already happened this year. Mothering Sunday falls in March, usually early March, I think, in England. And in Germany, I know it's a different day of the year, too. So Mother's Day seems to be very, very, very regional. In the Church of England, Mothering Sunday started as the day you would go to visit the church that you were baptized in. It was sort of homecoming church day. You go back to your mother church on Mothering Sunday. So it wasn't about your human mother necessarily, but it has become about human mothers now. So, yeah. All right, so the other cross-quarter day you're probably very familiar with, right, is the fall one. We're all very familiar with Halloween, and Halloween comes from All Hallows Eve. So the actual cross-quarter day is November 1st, not October 31st. And it is All Saints' Day in the church here. Again, I think these fall festivals, because they're celebrated in this time as the light is sort of dying, they make us more conscious of those things that we cannot see, right? And in the old pagan cultures, that was also a time of sort of feeling like the veil between the living and the dead is a little bit thinner. And so Day of the Dead in Mexico and some other cultures also have that sense of celebrating those things in the midst of the time that the light is dying here, but we are still surrounded by lights that we can't see. Okay, there's one more cross-quarter day, which we haven't talked about, and the reason we haven't talked about it is it's not one that really appears on our Protestant calendar at all. Anybody want to guess? August 1st is, in the Catholic tradition, it is the Assumption of Mary. So many, you may have noticed, many of these cross-quarter and these smaller festivals have to do with Mary. They all sort of track the human life of the Mother of God. And so in the Catholic tradition, Mary did not die, she was assumed into heaven. And so August 1st is the day that they mark that Assumption. But there's not any Protestant corollary for that. All right, that took us through everything. So what? I think calendars are fascinating. Even if you don't care about astronomy or math or even church history very much, there is something about calendars that both can be helpful and also sometimes they help us pay attention to our experience, and sometimes maybe they distract from our experience. At the Synod Assembly last year, they had a whole theme around agriculture, and they asked one of the farmers, how do you know when it's time to plant? How do you know? And of course, part of the reason we have calendars is that agriculturally, people wanted to be able to plan, like when's going to be about the time to plant, and they could guess more or less that it would fall, in a certain month of the year. But it's not always the same, right? A good farmer wouldn't just say, well, it's April 15th, got to plant now, no matter what, right? They're going to look at the temperature of the soil, they're going to look at what kind of winter they've had, they're going to look at what's happening with rain and other things in the natural world. So our calendars can help us pay attention to, like, oh look, we're halfway to spring, or we're halfway to fall, or they can, I think it can be a lovely way to pay attention to what is the moon doing right now. But they can also sometimes mediate our experience in a way that makes us not pay attention to what's actually happening. And I think in a time of climate change, it's a really interesting question to ask ourselves. What does it mean to have these calendars, have these expectations of seasons, when our seasons are not quite what they used to be, right? They're not behaving in the same way. So how do having these external dates and months and names for things help us pay attention, help us notice the differences, help us notice how our planet is changing? Sometimes our calendars kind of ask us to ignore what's going on in the natural world. That's especially true, I think, in capitalism. The reason we have a worldwide calendar that pretty much everybody uses the same Gregorian calendar all over the world. Why? For economic reasons, right? You can't have every part of the world following a different calendar. That would be chaos. The churches and religious traditions we've had our holdouts, right? We've had our ways of saying, no, the rest of the world says it's this, but we're saying it's that, as a way of holding our own, of a different way of marking time than what the secular world says it should be. One of our members, I don't see him here today, was talking about how working in retail, how he constantly feels like he's not really living in real time. He's always living in the future, right? Because they're setting up for Christmas in early October, and back to school stuff goes in early July, and everything is always to the future, to the future, to the future, to the future when you're trying to sell things. And he said, for him, as thinking about marking time and marking seasons and celebrations here in church, that can be really disjointed. It can feel really off. And so what does it mean to have a calendar that forces you to pay attention to where you are right now rather than what's into the future? And I think our culture right now often is pushing us always into the future instead of saying, what day are you at right now? Second Sunday of Easter. Like that's where we are right now. We're not in summer yet. So that's all I had. Yes? Also, okay, so in the Catholic tradition, so in the Lutheran tradition, we say All Saints' Day because we believe that everyone who's baptized is a saint and a sinner. At the same time, we are all saints. And so we are celebrating both the living saints and those who have gone before us at All Saints' Day. In the Catholic tradition, there is this different understanding of saints, right? Well, it has to do with the church saying, we will say who a saint is. There's criteria for someone who is called a saint. Their stories are documented, and there's a whole process by which they say this person was particularly holy in their living, and so we will call them a saint. So all the saints are celebrated on November 1st. November 2nd is All Souls, and that would be the rest of us. So in the Roman Catholic tradition, there's a distinction between celebrating All Saints and All Souls because only certain people are saints. In the Protestant tradition, we don't understand saints that way, so we just have the one day. Yeah. Yeah.
The difference in Easter between the Western and Eastern churches, do they both use the same formula for ecclesiastical meaning, but in one case it was just dating back to a different start date or something? Or are they separate in that?
I believe they don't use quite the same ecclesiastical moon, and I haven't been able to find a good answer on that. And part of the reason I think that is that Orthodox Easter tends to be closer to Passover than Western Easter does. So I think their calculation of the moon is more like the Hebrew calendar, but probably still not like dependent on the Hebrew calendar. Yeah.
Their Christmas is on a different day too, so how does that?
Yeah, and they don't not mark December 25th. They just would say that the most important day of Christmas is January 6th. Yeah. So they mark Epiphany, what we call Epiphany, as the height of Christmas. And December 25th is just sort of like the beginning of the Christmas season. Whereas we still say December 25th is the first day of Christmas, but but in common practice, most people don't do a lot of celebrating of Christmas after the 25th. Yeah. We do have 12 days of Christmas, all the way up to Epiphany. Yeah.
Just a more secular one, this reminds me, every city in the U.S. used to have its own time zone.
Yeah.
Because noon was when the sun was highest, where you were, and that didn't work either.
Yeah.
Trains would literally run into each other because there were time zones.
Yeah.
You may not know, Goodsell Observatory kept official time for most of the Midwest. They were the timekeepers for a big clock.
Yeah.
Goodsell said it was the national.
And for people who don't know what Goodsell is, that's the observatory at Carleton. Used to be the timekeeper, yeah. So commerce often is what has driven this idea of, okay, this should all be uniform, right? We should all be in sync with each other. But we're still not very much in sync. And maybe that's not all bad. There is something to be said for regional and cultural differences, right? And not having everything uniformized. I sometimes worry about what a uniform date of Easter would do, because I think, the commercial world would catch up with it, and then by being off sync, I think we've made it a little harder for the commercial world to commercialize Easter as much as it might. So that maybe there's something to say for that. Anyway, thank you all for coming. I really, yeah.